April 18, 1943, 8,000 feet above the Solomon Islands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto adjusts his reading glasses and studies intelligence reports in the cramped fuselage of his Mitsubishi bomber. Outside the window, 6 Zero fighters glide in lazy formation. The morning sun glints off the Pacific below. Everything is routine. Everything is safe. 400 miles to the south, Major John Mitchell checks his compass for the 47th time in 2 hours. His hands are steady on the controls, but his mind is racing. Below his P-38 Lightning, the Pacific stretches endlessly in every direction. No landmarks, no radio guidance. Just his calculations, his stopwatch, and 18 fighters burning through fuel they can't afford to waste. In 90 seconds, these two formations will collide, and only one of them knows it's coming. What happened in the skies over Bougainville that morning would become one of the most audacious missions in military history, a strike so improbable that Japanese intelligence would refuse to believe it for weeks. When investigators finally reached the crash site and measured the distances, when they calculated the intercept angles and the fuel requirements, they confronted an impossible truth. The Americans had executed a precision assassination 400 miles behind enemy lines, arriving exactly on time to the minute, and they'd done it in an aircraft the Japanese didn't know could fly that far. This is the story of Operation Vengeance, the day 18 American pilots proved that nowhere was safe, and no one was untouchable. But to understand how they did the impossible, we need to go back 5 days earlier, to a cramped basement in Pearl Harbor, where a team of cryptanalysts had just decoded a message that would change the war. April 13, 1943, Station Hypo, Pearl Harbor. The decrypt came through at 08:47 hours. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton stared at the decrypted message, read it twice, then reached for the secure phone to Admiral Nimitz's office. The message was extraordinarily specific. On April 18th, Admiral Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 0600 hours in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber. He would arrive at Balale Airfield near Bougainville at 0945 hours. 6 Zero fighters would provide escort. The message even specified which bomber Yamamoto would occupy. Every detail the Americans needed to plan an intercept. Every detail that suggested this was either a trap or an intelligence goldmine. Layton knew what this meant. The Japanese had no idea their naval codes were compromised. This wasn't just another intercept. This was a chance to eliminate the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. Within hours, the decrypt reached Admiral Chester Nimitz. The decision wasn't simple. Assassinating enemy commanders raised complex questions about military ethics, international law, and potential retaliation against Allied prisoners. But Yamamoto wasn't just any commander. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategic genius behind every major Japanese naval operation. His tactical brilliance and symbolic importance to Japanese morale made him irreplaceable. More importantly, if America could demonstrate they could reach anyone, anywhere, the psychological impact would be devastating. President Franklin Roosevelt's authorization came swiftly. Get Yamamoto. The mission fell to the Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron, stationed at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. But planning the intercept revealed problems that seemed insurmountable. Balale Airfield lay 435 miles northwest across open ocean. No navigation landmarks. Japanese-held islands dotted the route, bristling with coastal observers. The intercept window was brutally narrow. Yamamoto's bomber would be vulnerable for maybe 10 minutes. And most critically, no American fighter based at Guadalcanal had the range to reach Bougainville and return. The Grumman Wildcat had a combat radius of 175 miles, insufficient. The Vought Corsair could manage 400 miles, but only if pilots never deviated from perfect cruise settings, never climbed to combat altitude, and never maneuvered aggressively. One combat engagement, one navigation error, and they'd ditch in shark-infested waters. Only one aircraft could make the journey, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Major John Mitchell, commanding the 339th, stared at the map in the operations tent. 435 miles. over open ocean, no landmarks, no radio navigation. And they had to arrive precisely on time, because Yamamoto's bomber would be at the intercept point for less than 10 minutes. Mitchell was a taciturn combat veteran with 9 confirmed kills. He didn't waste words, and he didn't make mistakes. But this mission terrified him in ways combat never had. In a dogfight, you reacted on instinct. Navigation across 435 miles of featureless ocean required mathematics. 1 degree of compass error would put them 8 miles off course. At that distance, they'd never visually acquire the target. The mission would fail before it began. Mitchell spent 3 days working the calculations. Flight speed, fuel consumption, wind drift, climb performance. Every variable had to be perfect. He plotted a dogleg course, first west toward the Russell Islands, then northwest on a heading of 305 degrees. By staying low, between 10 and 50 feet above the waves, they'd remain below Japanese radar coverage. But flying that low for 2 hours, maintaining precise compass headings with no visual reference points, required navigation skills that bordered on supernatural. The fuel calculations were equally brutal. At optimal cruise settings, the P-38s would burn 140 gallons per hour. The outbound leg would consume 280 gallons. Climbing to attack altitude and conducting combat would burn another 100 gallons. The return flight required another 280 gallons. Total, 660 gallons. With drop tanks, they'd have 740 gallons total. That left 80 gallons reserve, maybe 40 minutes of flight time. No room for error. No room for extended combat. No room for getting lost. Mitchell knew what that meant. If his navigation was off by even a few miles, if they missed the intercept, they wouldn't have fuel to search. They'd have to turn back immediately. The mission would fail, and Yamamoto would live. On the evening of April 17th, Mitchell called the mission briefing. 18 pilots crowded into the operations tent. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. These were combat veterans, men who'd seen action over Guadalcanal. But something about Mitchell's expression told them this wasn't a routine mission. Mitchell pulled back the canvas covering the mapboard. Then he said 3 words that sent shockwaves through the room. "We're hunting Yamamoto." The tent went absolutely silent. Captain Tom Lanfear, one of the assigned killer pilots, would later recall that moment. You could have heard a pin drop. This wasn't just another intercept. This was a chance to eliminate the man who planned Pearl Harbor, the man who'd promised to dictate peace terms in the White House. Mitchell laid out the mission profile. 12 P-38s would provide high cover against Japanese interceptors. 4 P-38s would form the killer flight, engaging Yamamoto's bombers directly. Mitchell would navigate and control the formation. Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber would make the actual attack. Mitchell went through the fuel calculations, the navigation plan, the intercept geometry. Then he said something that stuck with every pilot in that room. "Gentlemen, this is the longest fighter intercept ever attempted. The navigation has to be perfect. The timing has to be perfect. Your fuel discipline has to be perfect. If any of you have doubts about your ability to execute this mission exactly as planned, speak now." No one spoke. "Good. We launch at 0713 hours. Get some sleep. You're going to need it." That night, Mitchell lay awake in his tent, rechecking his calculations one more time. 435 miles, 2 hours and 25 minutes at cruise speed. Arrival time, 0938 hours. Yamamoto's bomber was scheduled to arrive at 0945. That gave them a 7-minute margin. 7 minutes. After flying for nearly 2.5 hours, Mitchell closed his eyes and ran through the mission again in his mind. Every heading change, every checkpoint, every decision point. When he finally fell asleep at 0200 hours, he dreamed of compasses and fuel gauges and an endless blue ocean. At 0630 hours on April 18th, the P-38 pilots walked out to their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness. Henderson Field's steel matting runway stretched before them, still damp with morning dew. Ground crews had worked through the night, loading each Lightning with full internal fuel, 2 165-gallon drop tanks, 4 50-caliber machine guns with 500 rounds each, and 1 20-millimeter cannon with 150 rounds. Total takeoff weight? Over 18,000 pounds. The heaviest operational load the P-38s had ever carried. Lieutenant Rex Barber stood beside his aircraft, number 122, and stared at the fuel gauge indicators. The drop tanks hung heavy beneath the wings. He did the math in his head one more time. 435 miles out. Combat. 435 miles back. If Mitchell's navigation was off, if they missed the intercept, if they encountered headwinds, they'd run out of fuel over open ocean. No rescue aircraft had that range either. If they went down, they died. Simple as that. "You ready, Rex?" Tom Lanfear's voice cut through his thoughts. Lanfear stood beside his own P-38, number 122, grinning with that cocky confidence that made him either inspiring or insufferable, depending on your mood. "Ready as I'll ever be," Barber replied. "Relax. We fly 2 hours, shoot down a couple of bombers, and we're home for lunch. Easy day." Barber didn't respond. He'd flown with Lanfear long enough to know the man's bravado hid the same fear they all felt. You just dealt with it differently. At 07:13 hours, Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio. "All aircraft, this is Scalper Leader. Start engines." 18 Allison V-1710 engines roared to life across Henderson Field. The sound was deafening. The counter-rotating propellers created a distinctive whine that every pilot recognized instantly. This was the sound of the fork-tailed devil. Mitchell advanced his throttles and rolled onto the runway. Behind him, 17 P-38s followed in sequence. The heavily loaded Lightnings needed every foot of runway to get airborne. Mitchell pulled back on the yoke at 110 miles per hour, and his P-38 clawed into the morning air. One by one, the formation climbed away from Guadalcanal. Below them, Henderson Field shrank into the distance. Ahead lay the Pacific, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. No landmarks, no radio beacons, just Mitchell's compass and a rendezvous that had to be perfect. At 07:20 hours, the formation descended to wave-top altitude, 50 feet above the water, close enough that spray occasionally misted the windscreens. This was below Japanese radar coverage, but it was also dangerous flying. One moment of inattention, one slight miscalculation, and you'd hit the water at 200 miles per hour. Mitchell checked his compass, heading 265 degrees. Speed, 185 miles per hour indicated, probably 220 over the ground, accounting for wind. He glanced at his fuel gauges, consumption tracking exactly as planned. Behind him, 17 P-38s maintained perfect formation. Radio silence was absolute. No one spoke, no one transmitted. The only sounds were the steady drone of engines and the whistle of wind over the canopy. For 2 hours and 20 minutes, they flew through absolute nothingness. Blue sky above, blue ocean below. The monotony was hypnotic and dangerous. Pilots had to fight the urge to doze, to let their minds wander. Every few minutes, Mitchell checked his compass, verified his heading, calculated his position. At 08:30, they passed the Russell Islands off their left wing. First, checkpoint reached exactly on time. Mitchell felt a slight easing of tension. The navigation was working. But the hardest part lay ahead. Open ocean, no reference points. Just 305 degrees magnetic and faith in mathematics. Inside Yamamoto's bomber, the Admiral finished reading his intelligence summary and set it aside. Chief Warrant Officer Takeo Kotani, his pilot, maintained steady altitude at 8,000 feet. The 6-0 escorts flew lazy patterns around the two bombers. Everything was routine. Yamamoto stared out the window at the endless blue below. He was tired. The inspection tour had been exhausting, traveling from base to base, reviewing defenses, talking to commanders who increasingly had no good news to report. American forces were grinding forward across the Solomons. Japanese losses were unsustainable and Tokyo kept demanding victories that Yamamoto knew were no longer possible. He thought about his warning to the government before Pearl Harbor. "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no expectation of success." That warning had proven prophetic. It had been 16 months since Pearl Harbor. Japan's offensive capability was spent. Now they fought a defensive war against an enemy with unlimited resources and growing technological superiority. Yamamoto closed his eyes. In 30 minutes, they'd land at Balele. More inspections, more discussions about insufficient supplies and insufficient reinforcements. The war was lost. He knew it. Most of the senior commanders knew it, but no one could say it aloud. At 0933 hours, Major John Mitchell saw a thin gray line on the northern horizon. Bougainville. He checked his watch. They'd been flying for 2 hours and 20 minutes. According to his calculations, they were 7 miles from the planned intercept point. 7 miles. After flying 428 miles over open ocean, Mitchell's hands were steady on the controls, but his heart was pounding. This was it. Either Yamamoto's bomber would be where American intelligence predicted, or they'd flown 435 miles for nothing. He keyed his radio. First transmission in over 2 hours. "All aircraft, this is Scalper Leader. Bogies should be in sight. Maintain radio discipline." The formation climbed from 50 feet to 2,000 feet, gaining altitude for the intercept while staying below the expected altitude of Yamamoto's formation. Mitchell scanned the sky ahead, searching. Nothing. Empty sky, blue horizon. Mitchell's stomach tightened. Had they missed? Was Yamamoto late? Early? Had the intelligence been wrong? Then Lieutenant Doug Canning's voice crackled over the radio. "Scalper Leader, bogies, 11 o'clock high, 2 bombers, 6 fighters." Mitchell snapped his head left and up. There, against the lighter blue of the sky, he saw them. 2 Mitsubishi G4M bombers in loose formation, 6 A6M-0s weaving around them in escort pattern. Exactly as intelligence had predicted. Exactly where Mitchell's navigation had placed them. It was 0934 hours. Yamamoto's formation was scheduled to arrive at Balale at 0945. They were 11 minutes from landing, and the Americans had just appeared out of nowhere, 435 miles from their base, at exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. Mitchell's voice was calm, almost conversational. "Killer flight, drop tanks, and go get them. Cover flight, stay with me." 4 P-38s, Lanfear, Barber, and their wingmen released their drop tanks and punched throttles forward. The Allison engines screamed to full power. The Lightnings accelerated toward the Japanese formation like projectiles. In the lead zero, Lieutenant Kenji Yanagiya spotted the American fighters climbing from below. For a moment, his brain refused to process what he was seeing. P-38s? Here? 400 miles from Guadalcanal? Impossible. But the fork-tailed silhouettes were unmistakable. Yanagiya keyed his radio. American fighters attacking from below." In Yamamoto's bomber, pilot Takeo Kotani heard the warning and reacted instantly. He pushed the control column forward, diving toward the jungle canopy below. If they could reach the trees, the P-38s couldn't follow. Just get to the airfield, just get to the ground. Behind him, Vice Admiral Ugaki's bomber also dove hard. The 6 Zeros scattered, trying to position for attacks on the climbing P-38s, but they were too late. The Americans had altitude advantage, speed advantage, and total surprise. Tom Lanfear pulled his P-38 into a hard climbing turn, trying to intercept Yamamoto's bomber before it reached the jungle. His aircraft vibrated with speed and G-forces. The bomber was diving hard, trailing smoke from emergency power settings. Rex Barber took a different approach. He stayed low, cutting across the bomber's escape path. If it made it to the trees, he'd have one passing shot. That was it. Above them, the 12 P-38s of the cover flight engaged the 6 Zeros in a swirling dogfight. The Japanese pilots were good, aggressive, but they were outnumbered 2-1, and the P-38s had every advantage except maneuverability. Barber watched Yamamoto's bomber descending toward the jungle, estimating lead, calculating the deflection angle. The bomber was fast, maybe 250 miles per hour in the dive. Closing speed over 400 miles per hour. He'd have maybe 2 seconds to fire. He thumbed the gun switches, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all pointed exactly where his nose pointed. No convergence issues, just aim and destroy. The bomber filled his windscreen. Barber squeezed the trigger. The P-38 shuddered as all 5 guns fired simultaneously. The combined firepower, over 100 pounds per second of shells and bullets, raked the bomber from right engine to tail. The effect was catastrophic. The Mitsubishi G4M, nicknamed hamaki or cigar by Japanese crews for its tendency to explode when hit, lived up to its reputation. The right engine erupted in flames. The wing root ruptured. Fuel sprayed into the slipstream and ignited. In the cockpit, Kotani fought the controls as his aircraft disintegrated around him. Hydraulics failed. The control surfaces stopped responding. The bomber rolled left, nose down, accelerating into an uncontrollable descent. Yamamoto, seated in the cabin, had just enough time to realize what was happening. Just enough time to understand that American fighters had found him 400 miles behind Japanese lines. Just enough time to know he was about to die. Then, the bomber hit the jungle canopy at over 200 miles per hour. Above, Tom Lanphier had engaged the second bomber, guns hammering. The bomber's left engine exploded. The wing separated. Vice Admiral Ugaki's aircraft tumbled into the jungle in pieces. The entire engagement, from first contact to both bombers destroyed, had lasted 93 seconds. Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos. "All aircraft, break off. We're going home, now." The P-38s disengaged from the scattered Zeros and dove for the deck. Behind them, black smoke rose from 2 crash sites in the jungle. Ahead lay 435 miles of open ocean and fuel tanks that were already critically low. The return flight was a nightmare of fuel management. Every pilot watched their gauges drop with sickening speed. Mitchell set crews at the most efficient settings possible, but combat had burned through reserves they couldn't afford to lose. At 10:47 hours, Lieutenant Raymond Hines' voice came over the radio, tight with suppressed panic. "Scalper leader, this is Scalper 12. I'm out of fuel." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Scalper 12, can you make the Russell Islands?" "Negative. I'm ditching. Now." They were still 120 miles from Guadalcanal, far beyond rescue range. Hine put his P-38 down in the water as gently as possible. But the Pacific was unforgiving. The aircraft sank in less than 30 seconds. Hine was never found. The remaining 17 P-38s continued toward Guadalcanal, each pilot calculating their own fuel situation, wondering if they'd make it. At 11:23 hours, Henderson Field appeared on the horizon. Mitchell's fuel gauge showed almost empty. Red warning lights glowed on his instrument panel. His engines were running on fumes. One by one, the P-38s touched down on Henderson Field's steel matting. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, checking battle damage, measuring fuel remaining. Most aircraft had less than 10 gallons in their tanks. Some had less than 5. Mitchell shut down his engines and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was wearing off. They'd flown 870 miles, navigated with precision across featureless ocean, intercepted the target exactly on time, destroyed both bombers, and gotten 17 of 18 pilots home alive. It was the most audacious fighter mission of the war, and they'd pulled it off. In the operations tent, intelligence officers debriefed the pilots. Lanphier claimed he'd shot down Yamamoto's bomber. Barber claimed the same kill. The debate over who actually delivered the fatal rounds would continue for decades, with both pilots' claims supported by different evidence and witnesses. But that debate missed the larger point. Both pilots had executed a mission of extraordinary difficulty after navigating 435 miles without error. Both had engaged targets under combat conditions against numerically superior opposition. Both had returned safely despite marginal fuel reserves. The mission succeeded because 18 pilots had done the impossible. The question of who pulled the trigger mattered far less than the fact that they'd all gotten home. For 3 days, American intelligence monitored Japanese communications, waiting for confirmation. The intercepts revealed nothing. Had they killed Yamamoto, or just destroyed 2 random bombers? Then, on April 21st, Japanese radio traffic exploded with urgent, encrypted communications. Station Hypo decoded them within hours. The messages confirmed what the Americans had suspected. Admiral Yamamoto was dead. In Tokyo, the announcement sent shockwaves through Japanese command. Yamamoto was irreplaceable. His strategic genius, his understanding of modern naval warfare, his ability to inspire confidence in impossible situations, all gone in 90 seconds of combat. His replacement, Admiral Minechi Koga, was competent but conventional. He lacked Yamamoto's vision and aggressive instinct. Japanese naval operations became increasingly defensive and reactive. But more importantly, the successful intercept revealed something that terrified Japanese intelligence. American fighters had appeared 435 miles from their base at exactly the predicted time, at exactly the predicted location. This suggested either extraordinary luck or something far more disturbing. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes and could read operational traffic. Investigation teams reached the crash site near Bougainville and found wreckage scattered across a hillside. Yamamoto's body was still strapped in his seat, thrown clear when the bomber disintegrated on impact. Medical examination revealed he'd been killed instantly, probably by .50 caliber rounds that struck him during Barber's attack run. Japanese investigators measured distances from the crash site to known Allied bases. Henderson Field lay 435 miles away. The mathematics were inescapable. American fighters had flown farther than any previous intercept mission, navigated with impossible precision, and struck with surgical accuracy. The implications were devastating. If the Americans could reach Yamamoto 400 miles behind Japanese lines, no commander was safe, no base was secure, no territory was truly controlled. The psychological impact rippled through Japanese forces across the Pacific. The man who had promised to dictate peace terms in the White House had been eliminated by pilots he never saw, flying aircraft he didn't know existed, guided by intelligence he never suspected was compromised. For American forces, Operation Vengeance provided a tremendous morale boost. The successful strike proved that American aviation technology, American planning, and American pilot skill could execute missions of extraordinary complexity. The P-38 Lightning that made the mission possible became legendary. Its twin-boom configuration, tricycle landing gear, and counter-rotating propellers made it instantly recognizable. Japanese pilots called it Futago no Akuma, the fork-tailed devil, though whether this nickname was used during the war or emerged later remains debated. Regardless of its origins, the name fit. The Lightning was unlike any other fighter in the Pacific theater. The twin Allison V1710 engines, each producing 1,475 horsepower, gave it exceptional range and redundancy. The central nacelle housed the pilot and all armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, creating concentrated firepower with no convergence issues. The turbo superchargers maintained full power at altitudes where other fighters struggled. But it was range that made the Lightning irreplaceable. With internal fuel and drop tanks, it could fly over 1,150 miles. No other American fighter came close. This capability transformed Pacific air operations, allowing escort missions deep into enemy territory and long-range intercepts that had been impossible before. The Lightning's combat record validated its design. P-38 units in the Pacific destroyed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft. The top two American aces, Major Richard Bong with 40 victories and Major Thomas Maguire with 38, both flew P-38s exclusively. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Lightnings reported consistent themes. The fork-tailed fighter was fast, heavily armed, and could absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese aircraft. Head-on attacks, effective against lightly built American fighters, were suicidal against the Lightning's concentrated nose armament. The twin engines meant P-38s regularly returned to base with one engine shot out, something single-engine pilots could never do. Saburo Sakai, Japan's highest-scoring surviving ace with 64 victories, wrote about encountering P-38s over Guadalcanal. The fork-tailed fighter was the most dangerous aircraft we faced. It was fast, heavily armed, and could absorb tremendous punishment. Attacking from behind was dangerous, because their firepower was devastating. Attacking from ahead was fatal, because you flew directly into 8 heavy weapons firing simultaneously. The strategic implications of Operation Vengeance extended far beyond eliminating one commander. Japanese naval leadership never fully recovered from Yamamoto's loss. His successors were competent, but lacked his strategic vision and aggressive instinct. Japanese operations became increasingly defensive. More significantly, the successful intercept demonstrated that American intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications at the highest levels. Japanese code changes following the incident came too late. American cryptanalysts had already compromised the updated systems. This intelligence advantage would prove decisive in campaigns from the Philippines to Iwo Jima. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was equally devastating. If Yamamoto could be eliminated with surgical precision 400 miles behind Japanese lines, no one was safe. The message was clear. American reach extended anywhere. American intelligence penetrated everywhere. And American fighters could hunt across distances that defied belief. For the Lightning pilots who flew Operation Vengeance, recognition came swiftly. Major John Mitchell received the Navy Cross, an unusual decoration for an Army officer, reflecting the mission's strategic importance to naval operations. His navigation, bringing the formation to the intercept point within 1 minute of planned time after 435 miles over open ocean, was a masterpiece of precision flying. Captain Tom Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber both received the Navy Cross for engaging Yamamoto's bomber. The controversy over who actually delivered the fatal rounds would simmer for decades, occasionally flaring into public disputes. Both men claimed credit. Both had supporting evidence. Both deserved recognition. But ultimately, the debate missed the point. Operation Vengeance succeeded because 18 pilots executed a mission of extraordinary complexity without significant error. The navigation was perfect. The fuel management was perfect. The combat execution was perfect. And 17 of 18 pilots came home alive. That combination of technological excellence, operational planning, and pilot skill defined American air power in the Pacific. And on April 18, 1943, it delivered a message that echoed across the theater. Nowhere was safe. No one was untouchable. American fighters could hunt anywhere their enemies tried to hide. The P-38 Lightning that made it possible represented more than just technological achievement. It represented American industrial capability, the ability to design and mass-produce aircraft that Japan could never match. While Japanese factories struggled to replace combat losses, American production lines delivered P-38s by the thousands. While Japanese pilots flew aircraft with minimal armor and unprotected fuel tanks, American pilots climbed into heavily armed, well-protected fighters that gave them every advantage technology could provide. This industrial superiority decided the Pacific War, as surely as any battle. By 1944, American forces were producing aircraft faster than Japan could eliminate them. Pilot training reflected similar advantages. American fighter pilots arrived in combat with 400 hours of flight time. Japanese pilots, facing desperate fuel shortages, entered combat with less than 100 hours. The result was inevitable. American pilots flying superior aircraft, supported by unlimited resources and backed by industrial capacity that replaced losses within days, systematically destroyed Japanese air power. By 1945, Japanese fighters rarely opposed American formations, not because Japanese pilots lacked courage, but because so few remained alive. The Yamamoto intercept foreshadowed this outcome. The mission demonstrated that American technology, American planning, and American pilot skill could execute operations that Japanese forces could not counter or even comprehend. Today, preserved P-38 Lightnings sit in museums across America, their twin booms and distinctive profiles instantly recognizable. These aircraft represent more than technological achievement. They represent the capability that won the war. They represent missions like Operation Vengeance, operations so audacious and precisely executed that the enemy refused to believe them possible, even after examining the wreckage. Japanese investigators searching the jungle near Bougainville on April 18, 1943, found debris scattered across a hillside and the body of their nation's most celebrated admiral. As they measured distances, calculated intercept geometry, and examined the concentrated pattern of battle damage, they confronted a reality that shattered their assumptions. American fighters had hunted across 400 miles of ocean and struck with precision that seemed supernatural. The fork-tailed devil, whether Japanese pilots truly called it that during the war or the name emerged later in legend, had spoken. And Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategic genius who had warned his own government that America's industrial might would prove decisive, became proof of his own prophecy. Eliminated by a fighter his nation could never match, flown by pilots his forces could never train in sufficient numbers, guided by intelligence his codes could not protect against. 435 miles, precision navigation across featureless ocean, perfect timing, overwhelming firepower, safe return with nearly empty tanks. Operation Vengeance demonstrated everything the P-38 Lightning was designed to achieve, and everything American air power would become: unstoppable, inescapable, absolutely decisive. Major John Mitchell's navigation brought them to the target within 1 minute after flying for 2.5 hours without landmarks or radio guidance. That alone was a feat of airmanship that few pilots could match. But Mitchell would later say the navigation wasn't what kept him awake at night. It was the young lieutenant whose fuel ran out 120 miles from home. Raymond Hine, who flew the mission perfectly, who followed every order exactly, who did everything right and still went into the ocean and never came up. That was the real cost of Operation Vengeance, not just fuel calculations and navigation precision, but the knowledge that even when you did everything perfectly, sometimes the Pacific claimed you anyway. 17 P-38s landed at Henderson Field that day with nearly empty tanks. One didn't make it home. And on the bottom of the Pacific, somewhere between Bougainville and Guadalcanal, lies a P-38 Lightning with Lieutenant Raymond Hine still in the cockpit. He was 23 years old. He'd flown one of the most important missions in military history, and his name appears on no list of heroes, no memorial to Operation Vengeance. Just another pilot who didn't make it home. Just another statistic in a war that consumed millions. But every pilot who flew that mission knew. Every P-38 pilot who came after knew. The Lightning could fly farther than any other fighter. It could deliver devastating firepower. It could execute missions that seemed impossible, but it couldn't make fuel last longer than physics allowed. And sometimes, even when you did everything right, that wasn't enough. On April 18, 1943, 18 American pilots launched from Henderson Field on a mission that would change the war. 17 came home, and in the jungles of Bougainville, wreckage smoldered, and Japanese investigators measured impossible distances and tried to comprehend how American fighters had reached across 400 miles of ocean to strike with perfect precision. The answer was simple and terrifying. The P-38 Lightning wasn't just another fighter. It was a weapon that redefined what was possible. A weapon that could hunt anywhere. A weapon that Japan could build nothing to counter. And Operation Vengeance was its masterpiece. The day American pilots proved that no distance was too far, no target too protected, and no enemy too important to escape justice. 435 miles, 3 hours and 10 minutes. One of the most precise strikes in military history, and a message that echoed across the Pacific for the rest of the war. Nowhere is safe. No one is untouchable. The fork-tailed devil can reach you anywhere. Admiral Yamamoto knew this truth better than anyone. He'd warned his own government before Pearl Harbor that waking the sleeping giant of American industry would prove fatal. He'd predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but after that, American technological and industrial superiority would become overwhelming. He was right. And on April 18, 1943, over the jungles of Bougainville, he became the proof of his own prophecy. Hunted down by fighters he never knew existed, eliminated by pilots flying a mission he would have considered impossible, killed instantly by concentrated firepower from aircraft designed and built by the industrial giant he'd warned about. The architect of Pearl Harbor, eliminated by the very forces he'd warned would ultimately destroy Japan. There's a brutal poetry in that. A strategic genius who saw the future clearly, who understood exactly how the war would end, who tried to warn his superiors, and who ultimately became the first major casualty of the very industrial superiority he'd predicted would decide the war. Operation Vengeance wasn't just an assassination. It was a message. It was proof. It was America demonstrating that everything Yamamoto had feared was already here. The technology, the industrial capacity, the operational capability, the intelligence superiority. All of it, focused into one mission that flew 435 miles across open ocean and eliminated Japan's greatest naval commander with surgical precision. And the weapon that delivered that message, the P-38 Lightning, continued flying for the rest of the war, escorting bombers to Tokyo, hunting shipping across thousands of miles of ocean, and proving again and again that American air power could reach anywhere. By war's end, P-38 squadrons had flown tens of thousands of missions across the Pacific. They'd destroyed over 1,800 Japanese aircraft. They'd escorted countless bomber formations deep into enemy territory. They'd conducted reconnaissance over heavily defended targets. They'd proven that unconventional design and engineering excellence could create weapons that changed the nature of warfare. But Operation Vengeance remained unique, the longest fighter intercept mission of the war, the most precise navigation over open ocean, the highest value target ever eliminated by fighter aircraft, and proof that when American technology, intelligence, and pilot skill combined, nothing was impossible. Major John Mitchell flew combat missions for the rest of the war, but he never stopped thinking about that flight. 435 miles over open ocean. Navigation accurate to within 1 minute after 2.5 hours of flight. Every calculation perfect. Every decision correct. And still, one pilot didn't make it home. That was the reality of war. You could plan perfectly, execute flawlessly, and still lose people. The Pacific didn't care about your calculations or your courage. Physics didn't care about your skill or your determination. Sometimes the fuel ran out. Sometimes the ocean won. But 18 pilots launched that morning knowing the risks, knowing that fuel margins were razor thin, knowing that if anything went wrong, if navigation was off by even a few miles, if combat lasted longer than planned, if they encountered headwinds on the return, they'd run out of fuel over empty ocean with no hope of rescue. And they launched anyway, because the mission mattered, because Yamamoto mattered, because proving that American forces could reach across 400 miles to eliminate high-value targets would change the psychological calculus of the entire war. They were right. After Operation Vengeance, no Japanese commander felt safe. No base felt secure. No inspection tour happened without the knowledge that American fighters might appear out of nowhere, exactly on time, exactly on target, and deliver devastating firepower before anyone could react. That psychological pressure, that constant awareness that nowhere was safe, contributed to Japanese defensive thinking for the rest of the war. Aggressive operations gave way to defensive postures. Risk-taking commanders became cautious. Initiative shifted entirely to American forces, all because 18 P-38 pilots proved that American reach extended anywhere, that American intelligence could read Japanese communications in real time, that American fighters could fly farther, hit harder, and execute more complex missions than anything in the Japanese inventory. The fork-tailed devil had earned its name, and Operation Vengeance was the mission that made it legend. Today, when aviation historians discuss the greatest fighter missions of World War II, Operation Vengeance stands alone. Not for the number of aircraft destroyed, not for the tactical complexity, but for the sheer audacity of conception and perfection of execution. 435 miles over open ocean without navigation aids, arrival within 1 minute of planned time, successful interception of a high-value target, destruction of both primary bombers, and return to base with 17 of 18 aircraft, despite fuel reserves that would terrify any modern pilot. It was a mission that defined what American air power could achieve when technology, intelligence, planning, and skill aligned perfectly. And it was made possible by an unconventional aircraft that looked like nothing else in the sky. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms, tricycle landing gear, and concentrated nose armament. An aircraft that conventional wisdom said was too large, too heavy, too complex to be an effective fighter. An aircraft that proved conventional wisdom wrong by flying farther, fighting harder, and executing missions that no other fighter could accomplish. The Lightning pilots who flew Operation Vengeance became legends. Their aircraft became icons, and their mission became proof that in war, as in engineering, innovation and excellence can achieve what conventional thinking says is impossible. On April 18, 1943, over the jungles of Bougainville, the impossible became real. And Admiral Yamamoto, the strategic genius who had warned about American industrial might, learned the truth of his own prophecy in the last seconds of his life. The sleeping giant was awake. The industrial colossus was producing weapons Japan could never match. And American air power could reach anywhere, strike anyone, and change the course of history with surgical precision. That was the legacy of Operation Vengeance. That was the message of the fork-tailed devil. And that was why when the war finally ended in August 1945, it ended with American forces possessing absolute air superiority across the entire Pacific theater. Because missions like Operation Vengeance had proven again and again that American technology and American pilots could do the impossible. 400 miles, 3 hours and 10 minutes. Perfect navigation, perfect timing, perfect execution, and one of the most important military strikes of the entire war. That was Operation Vengeance. That was the P-38 Lightning. And that was why, even today, aviation historians study that mission as a masterpiece of planning, execution, and operational excellence. The day 18 American pilots did the impossible and changed the war.